Well, 2018 is gone, but what top issues did it leave behind and how have they affected us? We'll find out on Talking with Henrietta, coming up next. Hi, I'm Henrietta. Welcome to the show, and welcome to a new year. For many, a new year is accompanied by a feeling of optimism. Why? Because it brings with it the idea that we can now take steps to achieve whatever it is that we didn't achieve in the previous year. But one question pops up. What do we do in the previous year? What did we do? What happened? What were the top forces and issues that affected our lives? On this show, I have three local journalists with me who will look at the top stories of 2018, how they affected our area, and what we can look forward to this year. All three work for the Palo Alto Weekly and its online website, Palo Alto Online. Seated to my far left is Jocelyn Dong. Jocelyn has been the editor of the Palo Alto Weekly for the past 8 years, and she oversees a newsroom of 11 journalists. She grew up in Palo Alto and has written about land use, neighborhoods, health, and business. Next is staff writer Janati Shaner. Janati has reported for the Weekly since 2008 and has covered major land use and transportation issues and issues affecting the city of Palo Alto. Staff writer Sue Dremen is seated to my right. Sue has been with the Weekly since 2001 and is the paper's general assignment reporter, covering courts, crime, environment, neighborhoods, and many other issues. Well, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
You have had, I guess, a lot of experience over the past year covering all kinds of issues. So if we start on the national level, what do you think were some of the top national issues that maybe affected us the most?
Well, of course, the Me Too movement was huge last year, and we saw kind of the national and the local merge when Christine Blasey Ford stepped forward to accuse Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh of sexual assault. And I think there are a lot of things that kind of were in the air about the Me Too movement, just giving a lot of women courage to step forward. There wasn't any national policy. It wasn't something that they were deciding in Congress, but it was definitely a movement where we saw celebrities, politicians, news people, CBS executives, come under the consequences of their actions.
Yes, and I guess one of the biggest ramifications of that was with the Christine Blasey Ford issue, and Bruce Kavanaugh, now Judge Kavanaugh.
Yeah, Brett Kavanaugh, and I think just kind of piggybacking on what Jocelyn just said, we were kind of struck when we put together our year-end coverage how many times Palo Alto in this area made the national headline. Yeah, how the news out here kind of went past the Silicon Valley bubble and were national news. And I think Christine Blasey Ford is probably the biggest example. It's, one of the kind of most famous symptoms of the Me Too movement. But also we had the recall of Judge Persky in June, which was also a national story that kind of the first time in decades when a judge has been recalled in California. And of course, he was recalled because of his, what many perceived to be a very lenient sentencing of a Stanford athlete who was found guilty of sexual assault. So those two things is probably not the most kind of cheerful ways for Palo Alto to enter the spotlight. I mean, we're journalists, we're going to start with the bad news.
You mean we can end with good news?
It's not all bleak, it's not all bleak.
Okay, we'll see. And you had mentioned Me Too before we started. Yes.
Yeah, and I think one of the issues that we're seeing sort of evolve over time in Palo Alto and Stanford is there are a lot of issues being raised right now about how much protection women are really getting, how much justice they're getting, whether or not there are people coming at whether or not they're being prosecuted when, adequately, whether or not things are being reported to the police or to the sheriff's department. So these are all issues that are coming up right now. We're just having right now, unfortunately, a little wave of sexual assaults in town. So this is all brings to the fore the position that women are in society, and this is.
Do you think
it's going to escape?
It's very interesting when something becomes newsworthy, how all of a sudden we all become aware of it. So do you think things are worse now than they have been, or is it just that the spotlight is on these issues and they're more in our consciousness?
Well, it depends on what you're talking about. I think certainly when we're talking about just the sexual assaults, there is a spate. Why that is happening, I don't know. I don't know whether that's because some people just think that they have the opportunity now, it's okay somehow to do it, or what the reasons are behind it. I think if we look, more globally, that these issues have always been there, and but people are just speaking up more about them. So I think Christine Blasey Ford is a good example, and she is, of course, local. She's a Palo Alto and Stanford person, and I think that when you have more high-profile people coming out, then other people feel empowered to come out as well.
Sure. Now, does that create a backlash, do you think? You talked about people being empowered, and then I think, aha, but then on the other side, there's always sometimes the backlash.
Well, I think as we saw in the Brett Kavanaugh thing, he's Judge Kavanaugh now on the highest court of the land, and Christine Blasey Ford had to leave town. There was all this money raised for her security, so she's certainly feeling the backlash. But I feel like these kinds of incidents are just kind of the most well publicized. But there's been all sorts of other kinds of stories along the same kind of theme. We heard the thing in Google. There's like high power executives in various corporations in the area who've been disciplined or not disciplined and should have been disciplined. It's a national story. You had the CBS scandal nationally. And it's just a reminder that, we always talk about how Silicon Valley is a bubble so far apart from everyone else, but we've grappled with many of the same issues that have kind of garnered some of the biggest national headlines in 2018.
Sure. What are some of the other ones?
Well, I think as we're getting close to people announcing their presidential runs for 2020, the theme of inequality is especially on the Democratic side, is becoming more prevalent. I feel like we're experiencing that in Silicon Valley. We have a huge housing crisis. On the one hand, Palo Alto's area code 94301 was the most expensive in all the nation. So
what about 94303?
I'll look to Jocelyn for that one. But it's creating all sorts of crazy challenges with housing, and that has gotten worse. I mean, and you asked a few minutes ago whether things are better or worse this year, and it's obviously in the eyes of the beholder. I feel like for a lot of people, the economy is doing well, unemployment's low. We haven't had any huge disasters. We had those horrible wildfires, but the housing challenges and the transportation challenges are definitely getting worse.
So you talk about unemployment low and the economy doing well, except a few weeks ago when it seems Wall Street went into a spin.
Right.
But we have all of these homeless, and the homeless are growing. The numbers of homeless and families who are getting assistance going to food banks. And so how do you explain when you talk about unemployment low? Of course, some of these people are employed and can't find housing, but well, how long will we continue? What are the forces?
Well, since the Great Recession ended in 2010.
Great Recession? What recession was that?
Great Recession.
Oh, great
I wish it was a gravy session.
Or a gravy recession.
Yeah, but the Bay Area added more than 700,000 jobs. 722,000 jobs is the latest estimate from this CASA group that just formed to talk about housing. It's only added about 100,000 housing units. And when you have 700,000 new jobs and only 100,000 new housing units, there's going to be a lot of people either commuting from super far away and making the traffic situation worse, or just not having a place to live, being forced to live in RVs, being forced to, facing displacement because of all sorts of economic pressures. So I think this trend that you're mentioning, I think, is kind of the dark side of the prosperity. There's so many
Sure.
jobs, people have no place to live.
Yeah, I'd like to add two things to that. First of all, I'm just starting to look at some numbers right now. I've been looking at some census data, and 2018, as far as I can tell, just looking at East Palo Alto, it appears, and I haven't added up the numbers entirely yet, but it appears that the percentage of people living below the poverty line is higher than it's been. So that number, was kind of consistent over time. It looks like it's jumped just in this one year.
So, that's what, in spite of the fact that President Trump talks about the number of Latinos and African Americans who are now employed, getting jobs,
Right.
that does not take into consideration the numbers in places like East Palo Alto that you're just talking
and
about.
how much money are they making? Because if they're
Exactly.
service employees, they're not making that much, and they can't keep up with these rising housing prices. I mean, even teachers and firefighters can't. So,
And it's
yeah.
amazing in East Palo Alto, which was one of the most affordable living spots, how now housing has gone up. You could find for like $1 million, $2 million, which
That's
is
right.
unheard of for
That's
a
right.
community like that. And you're right, for someone who's a service worker.
Yeah, and also rents have gone up tremendously too. If you got booted out of one place, you could easily before find, let's say the 70s or 80s, you might have been able to find a place. That's not the case now. Remember, you have to come up with the first and last month's rent. You have to have the cleaning deposit, all the different things that you have to have. And that is a tremendous amount of money. It's thousands and thousands of dollars.
Especially if you're, for a one-bedroom or a studio going for $1,000 to $2,000.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a lot.
Yeah, I mean, average service worker in Silicon Valley makes $31,000, and when you consider what the prices are for rent, $2,000, $3,000,
Yeah.
in
So
some cases
you have,
$4,000. It's
you
like,
have
just do the
many
math, it's
families
impossible.
who are living together. And
Right.
And you
Is
see
it-
them living in RVs.
yes, and I was going to ask Jocelyn, RVs were a real issue in East Palo Alto, still are. But
Yeah,
then
still
they're
are.
also an issue in Palo Alto,
And
right?
Mountain
Going
View.
down El Camino.
Absolutely. Yeah, and these people have jobs. It's not like they're homeless and not working. It's that they were priced out of whatever rental situation they were in. And Sue did a lot of interviewing up and down
Right.
El Camino of the people who were living there
Right.
in their cars or in their RVs. Some were Stanford workers, I believe.
Yeah, it was interesting. In 2017, this issue started to emerge. First, it emerged in Palo Alto, probably in the, like mid to late summer. People were starting to complain to the city, why aren't you enforcing your 72-hour parking rule, where you're supposed to move at least a half a mile, move your odometer has to trip that you move the car within 72 hours. And I went out and talked to a lot of people, and you had a few people who obviously had mental health issues. You had some people, one or two that appeared to have a drug problem, but I also came across Stanford employees, people who worked at the hospital, people who worked in the finance department, and these people were telling me, I can't afford to,
So you-
I have a house up in the mountains, but I can't find a job up there. Right?
So you mean to tell me that Stanford isn't paying its employees enough?
Well, it's hard to say what they're paying them, but they sure aren't able to afford to to stay here during the week. At least they're living in RVs. They made that choice. I've also run across nurses, and this is way before I even did that interview, that series of interviews, who were like trauma nurses, and they have to live out in the valley somewhere. It's a 4-hour drive. And
Oh
then
my
they were
goodness.
sleeping in parking garages and parking lots.
4-hour drive round trip or 4-hour drive one way?
One way from where they were living, and considering traffic and everything else. And they said by the time I would go home, I'd get maybe 3 or 4 hours of sleep. I have to get up and go back again because they had these long shifts. So they were just sleeping in like garages.
So tell
parking
me,
garages.
it's always interesting, do people like that get the job first while they're living in the area, and then have to move out of the area?
Yeah, I did find that was the case. They were living in apartments, or they had in one case a woman had a house that she had for her, she was living in an apartment that a large apartment with her mother and her elderly aunt. And then she had to basically couldn't afford it anymore, so she had a house out, I believe, in Fresno, and she put them in the house. She had to kick her renter out of that house, put the elderly people in that house, and then she bought an RV, and she was living on El Camino.
Sure. Now, Janata, you followed the city council meetings in Palo Alto. What was the upshot? Was there any sympathy for the RV dwellers along El Camino?
Well, the city council hasn't taken any action on RV dwellers, which I think could constitute sympathy in the sense that they haven't kicked him out for the most part. I think the police did actually end up enforcing the 72-hour ban. So
Yeah, they
so
did.
so in that sense, there was some action, but it's not an issue that kind of percolated to the city council level so much. It was handled pretty much by the police department. And the police chief's position is, we're not going to kick out people because they're homeless, but if they're breaking the law, we'll give them warning. There was like some kind of warning system instituted, and then they were asked to move. But that said, a lot of people just moved down the block or whatever, so that still remained an issue. And we've heard some complaints from business owners that didn't really fix the issue; it just moved it a little bit. So the Palo Alto City Council dealt with housing quite a bit this year. I mean, I think that was one of the big themes of 2018, and there's going to be a big theme in 2019. That conversation has changed, but they kind of dealt with other aspects of the housing problem. The zoning laws, that was the biggest one. They approved a new project, like for the missing middle, which is a term we heard a lot this year, which is people who don't qualify for kind of traditional BMR housing, but who, because they make too much, but who don't make enough to get market rate. So that's become a theme, and I think in 2019, the city council is poised to approve, like, just this upcoming next Monday, an affordable housing project for the first time
Well, it's
in like 6
interesting.
years.
There was one proposed for seniors about a year or so ago, and that was shot down. And
Oh,
so
how
many
time flies. 2013.
Was it 2013? It all seems like yesterday, or it's either yesterday or it was 5 years ago, or
Right.
was it that long ago?
Yeah, it was overturned in a referendum in 2013, and the city hasn't had an affordable housing
I
project
know,
since,
and
which is
people
kind
were
of
saying
remarkable.
if you can't have affordable housing for seniors in Palo Alto, how can you get affordable housing at all?
Well, on Monday we'll find out. They're supposed to approve their first pure below market rate housing complex since 2013. It's
Sure,
This one's
we'll
targeted
see.
for people with disabilities, right? Or is
Yeah.
that a large part?
There's like maybe a dozen units or so for adults with disabilities out of 59 total units. So
That's amazing. Jocelyn, as an editor, you've seen a lot of stories cross your desk. And
Certainly.
Yeah, in terms of the national level, any others that you think might be?
Well, immigration fears, continue. They started in 2017, and I know there are a lot of people who are maybe not accessing services, who don't want to give their information to anyone in authority because they're concerned that their status might be revealed. I know in East Palo Alto, it started affecting the schools, and the superintendent at the time needed to go out and reassure people that parents, ICE is not coming to the school to take away your child or to take away you. So there's been, an ongoing, I think, concern in the community.
Yes,
And
and
I'm still finding that, and when I'm reporting, I'm finding that people will not talk. They tell me I'm having this problem with my landlord, or I'm living in substandard conditions with rats or something, but I'm afraid to talk about it because I'm undocumented, and I'm really afraid that for retribution they'll turn me in.
Well, this area, California, has sanctuary cities like East Palo Alto. So
Right.
this should not be a problem if people know about it. How knowledgeable are people in terms of what rights they might have, even though they might be undocumented?
They're not. I'd say that there's still a lot of people who are, even when I say, well, you'll be protected and here's where you can get some free legal services if you really need them, and they're just afraid. They're paralyzed by fear, I think. That's one of the things that
justifiably
I
so.
see.
I mean,
Yeah.
considering the grave consequences of deportation, knowing that you live in a sanctuary city without really understanding what that means is probably
Right.
not going to alleviate your fears all that much if someone's knocking on your door at night. So.
And I guess that, if it's a sanctuary city, the feds can still come in and knock on a door and take someone away, right? they can wait outside and snatch somebody off a sidewalk or go to their place of work and take them. It's only when you're really talking about the city itself and city services and police, for example, that, you know, the locals are not going to do anything to you. But you still have a greater fear of something larger that's out there.
It's really quite interesting. I remember stories of people, while they might be protected by living in a sanctuary city, might go to court in a court case, and ICE officials might be there and arrest them right there, even though they had some type of protections.
Right. Right.
And I mean, we talked about how kind of Palo Alto transcends the bubble, but it goes both ways. I mean, you could live in an area where that has pretty progressive attitudes, but you can't get away from the national attitudes. I mean, just a few days ago, the president gave a speech kind of repeating his assertions about people coming from Mexico and the crime, the drugs, all that stuff. And if you're being vilified like this by the president, it's kind of hard to live completely securely.
And let's not forget that, you know, even though we live in this bubble that it seems to be pretty liberal, there are a lot of people here as well, and you can just read town square comments on Palo Alto online sometimes, and, you know, sometimes we even have to take them down because, you know, they really cross the line. And so there's a certain amount of prejudice out there.
Give us an example without crossing the line yourself.
Ooh, I'm on the spot. I don't know that I could give you an exact example, but let's just say.
But people are saying send them home, or they don't belong here.
Sure. And you know,
even for like a routine crime story, like, you know, someone commits a robbery and there's like a mugshot of the suspect, or, you know, or there's like a Hispanic name. It's not uncommon to have somebody in town square make like a derogatory comment about immigrants.
That's
like
right.
Like a bad generalization.
Yeah.
So.
They're all committing the crimes and they shouldn't be here type of thing. And so, you know.
In spite of the statistics that show that immigrants commit far less crime than native-born citizens who are citizens.
But you see, you'll see these comments come out whenever it's a Hispanic name, right? But you won't see those comments when it's any other person's name. You know, if it's Mr. McDougal who created the, you know, is the alleged criminal. So they're not making the same kinds. And then equally, there's other people on the other side of it who say, wait a minute, you know.
What is it? Is it that people don't notice? If it's an American-sounding name, is it that people don't notice, or?
I think some people.
Well, they commit crime, and, you know, of course, but.
Some people have prejudices, and this gives them an opportunity to vent their prejudices. I mean, when the president was giving his speech, he was talking about the crime that comes from people who immigrate from Mexico. But when you talk about some of the biggest crimes, you know, the Pittsburgh synagogue, you know, all the, like, you know, the Charlottesville, you know, it wasn't immigrants who were like causing deaths there, but it's just, you know, you pick an example that you want to pick. You see what you want to see.
Yes, exactly. That's it. People see what they want to see.
And frankly, online comments, because they allow anonymity, kind of acts as the id impulse for some people. You know, they're unfiltered because they're anonymous. So
now, another issue coming up for 2019 is Census 2020. Have you given that, and the citizenship question, talking about immigration, is that something that had been discussed in the weekly?
No.
Not really, not yet.
Yeah, we haven't gotten into the census too much.
Yeah.
We always spend a lot of time with it, like once it starts coming out in bits and pieces, and I'm sure we're going to get to do that. But it's certainly worrisome if you see any political party, with whoever's in power, kind of manipulating questions for political means. But
and asking people if they're citizens on the census, that really would affect the services and the count.
Yeah.
It would be very interesting to see, to compare what comes out of the 2020 census, if they have that question on there, compared to, you know, let's say last census, or even the, you know, the ones that the American survey that comes out every year that they just do, right? The spot surveys.
Yeah, the American Community Survey.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. ACS is an acronym was sticking in my brain. But anyway, but that, it would be very interesting to see if there's suddenly this huge drop-off. And you wouldn't be able to say that that's because all of these people decided that they're going to go back to where they came from, so to speak. I think it's more, it would be more that they're hiding out in the community.
Although statistics show that more people now, more immigrants are leaving the
Right.
U.S. going across the border, Mexican border, than those now coming in.
That's right.
However, those coming from Canada, people don't talk about the ones from Canada who are overstaying their visas.
Right.
Astute observation. I agree.
Yes,
Yeah.
although President Trump said we need more people like the, Scandinavians
Norwegians
or
or
something,
something, yeah.
Norwegians,
Norwegians.
maybe Canadians who kind of fit into that kind of category.
Yeah, I feel like we probably haven't spent as much time as a national, well, we definitely haven't spent as much time as national publications because immigration, citizenships are very much kind of federal issues which don't come to city councils very often. Like,
But there are huge Latino populations here, and I know the mobile housing unit, what was it?
Buena Vista Mobile Home Park.
Yes, exactly.
Huge
That
center.
was settled, right? That was settled, and the city, paid money to keep the residents there who were primarily Latino?
The County Housing Authority organized the funding, the purchase of the mobile home park from the private owner and brought in a service provider, and currently the mobile home park is undergoing renovations of all of the different units. Some are getting replaced, some are getting fixed up and repaired.
No one's being displaced, or no one's
one's-
been displaced. So would you say,
Correct.
Janani, that's a good story?
I do. No, it's a rare example of like the county and the city all kind of giving money, and the housing authority, as Jocelyn mentioned, kind of leading the effort. There were multiple funding sources. There was a lot of political support from the community, and we talked a little while ago about Palo Alto voters rejecting that low-income senior
Yes.
housing in 2013.
2013.
2013. But you know, they came out completely in favor of saving Buena Vista, which was slated to be kind of demolished and turned into like expensive condos or apartment buildings, something luxurious. So that was a good story. I feel like this was maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago. I don't know if it was. That also feels like a little some time has passed, but that's definitely one of the more positive stories on the
So
housing front.
talking about good stories, of which doesn't seem to be a concentration on.
Well, there are some
in the media.
I would
yes,
say that
I was
the
about
RVs.
to ask you.
Okay.
The RVs in East Palo Alto, people there organized through Project We Hope to open a parking lot for RV dwellers. Whereas, up until now, there's been just controversy over why are they on our street, or, there's been, unfortunately, some discharging their sewer
Waste. Yes.
but now
That
it's in the
still has
works.
to be resolved. It's
Right.
still in
It's
the
in progress.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
still hasn't opened yet, right? I think they're
No.
hoping maybe for February or something like that. I think there's some issues with the contractor. They had more work that needed to be done. It's my understanding from the city than had been anticipated because they're making some basic infrastructure changes, improvements there. But I think if you want to talk about good stories that also kind of hook into the national stories, that hook into the local stories,
Now,
it's
are
East,
these-
all the things we talked about. It's East Palo Alto.
I talk about big stories now that affect us. So would those good stories be big stories that affect us?
I think they are.
Okay.
I mean, I think that they are good stories because if we're talking about housing, we're talking about immigration, we're talking about people of color, and we're talking about displacement. We've seen a lot of things happening in East Palo Alto. East Palo Alto is very challenged right now by rising rents and home prices, right? And so that's a major issue. And then we go to city council meetings, as you and I have both done, and we hear a lot of people stand up and say, I can't afford to live here anymore. What are you doing to help me? Please help me. I'm not going to be a lot of people are saying that they can't afford to stay here, and where would they go? They wouldn't have jobs or anything, right? But East Palo Alto has taken some very interesting and creative turns. We'll see how it ends up in 2019.
Okay, now before we talk about what those turns are, we do need to point out the percentage of children in the Ravenswood City School District who are homeless.
Right, and I don't remember what that number is. Maybe one of the
At
others,
least,
I'm going
I
to
think
punt that
at
to
least
somebody else, but
maybe 30%
Yeah.
of them,
I thought
at
it was even
least.
more.
It was more.
I thought
Yeah,
it was close
30
to half.
like 50%.
Well,
yeah.
I was going to say that, but I thought I'd be conservative.
Okay, yeah,
Sure,
yeah. I think they
50%.
started at 30 and then it went up again. It went
And
up, yeah.
and how many students, even in the prep schools as well as in the public schools, who had to move away because their
Right.
parents can't afford it.
Right, yeah. And so I think what you're seeing is is East Palo Alto made the attempt, first of all, when they had to, the whole issue about people living on the street certainly came to the fore because, you know, if you drive through the community, there are an awful lot of RVs and large vehicles clogging the streets, plus lots of people living in, you know, multiple families living in houses.
Yes.
And the overcrowding issues in the cars and so on and so forth, it's really obvious.
Code violations. Yes.
Yeah, and you know, if you've been there for several decades, as I've been, you know, for several, meaning four decades at least, there you've seen the big changes from when hardly anybody had a car on the street to, you know, now they're double parked.
Yes, and people are complaining how they can't even get out of their own driveway because of all of the cars that are blocking.
Right, but the basic issue was that here, you know, you had people complaining, and rightly so, that sewage was being dumped by certain people, not all
RV
dwellers. Yeah, certain people who were in the RVs. And the city got out there because we were expecting a huge storm and that street floods to, you know, clean it up. And they evicted those people and had them move somewhere else. Well, people got very upset, right? Where are we going to go? There's no place else. Palo Alto doesn't want us. There's no place for us to go. And the city stepped up with Project We Hope in the community, and they put up, I think, well, the project is supposed to cost about $300,000 as a pilot program, the Safe Parking Program, which is going to, I think they had about 22 or so, maybe 22 to 29 RVs that they think that they can put on city-owned property temporarily. They can't do this as a permanent RV park, but because of state law, but they could do it temporarily and offer services to people. And get them off the street and get them what they need.
Yes.
And so I think that that's really, it's an innovative thing. It's not something that hasn't been done in some other places, but it certainly hasn't been done around here.
Sure, and it's very interesting how in some ways East Palo Alto leads the nation. Leads California in some of its legislation and some of its thinking. Now, I'm thinking, and it occurred to me as you were talking, another big issue, marijuana. Now, is that something that you've seen?
Well,
given coverage.
I've seen marijuana before, but I think Palo Alto has taken a pretty conservative stance on marijuana. When they had a chance to consider like some retail operations when marijuana got legalized, and they basically chose they don't want to go that route. So we have reported on what various cities are doing on the subject, and certainly there were some East Palo Alto officials, some Mountain View officials who believe that the cities could benefit from the tax revenue that could come from legalized marijuana, from having legit operations. But Palo Alto, where revenues aren't as big of a problem and where quality of life is all the rage, hasn't really gone that route. So it's been pretty quiet on the marijuana front in Palo Alto.
It's very,
I was going to say, one thing we are seeing, though, is marijuana advertising. That's true. Which we didn't have before.
In the paper.
Sure, yes. Delivery services or stores.
Yeah.
And that's acceptable advertising. Well, now that it's legal.
It's legal.
Yes. Now, talking about marijuana in terms of cities, East Palo Alto has been kicking it down the road.
Right. But it sounds like it's something they might, I can't remember exactly when, but I think they're going to try to look at it this year.
Yeah.
They're going to look at it this year, maybe as a pilot.
Yes, exactly.
And I think Mountain View, too. Doesn't Mountain View just pass something? They're going to open up, they're going to allow some or they're trying to figure out what they're going to do.
Yeah, I know that at least before the last election, there were a few council members who were very much in favor of it. It wasn't unanimous, but I know well, actually, both of them are no longer on the council.
You don't think that's why, do you?
I think it was housing that booted them off. That's what it was, the housing issues.
Yeah, it was the housing issues booted them off. Well, actually, I think Rosenberg termed out. But yeah, for Lenny Siegel, or he didn't run again, but Lenny Siegel got voted out, possibly because of the housing issues.
Yeah. Pro-affordable housing or anti-affordable housing?
He was very much pro. The people, not so much. But yeah, so I think in terms of the marijuana question, it ranked pretty low on Palo Alto's list of things to do. In fact, it didn't even really make the list. They were so busy talking about housing, traffic, transportation issues, which we haven't even delved into yet, but that was a big theme for 18 and 19. And I think infrastructure, which I think is one of the really good stories that we haven't gotten into, but certainly Sue spent a lot of time covering the creek issues. And
oh yes, and
that's,
before we do now, Jocelyn, just in terms of the stories that Janani mentioned, which ones would you take that would be on your list that made a difference for us?
Sure. Well, I think that considerable progress was made in certain policy areas like affordable housing. The affordable housing overlay in Palo Alto was approved, and now we're poised to have 59 units, 59, 57?
59,
59
yeah.
units.
BMR or?
BMR,
Yes.
all BMR.
And where would they be located?
El Camino,
Yeah.
kind of in central Palo Alto.
Yeah, in the Ventura neighborhood near Wilton Avenue.
Sure.
Yeah. I think a lot
Certainly not in old Palo Alto.
No.
No.
Palo Alto isn't nowhere near kind of putting multifamily housing in like single family neighborhoods, but they are getting a little more progressive about downtown California Avenue area and El Camino Real, and so we have seen movement. I feel like this year, I feel like we said it for a few years now, but this year they really did plant some seeds that they're hoping will kind of bear fruit in the next year or two.
It was kind of
the one Jocelyn
a
mentioned is going
stage
to bear fruit
setting.
immediately.
Yeah, stage setting year. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion which continues on about whether or not this housing crisis should be solved by specifically addressing housing for the very low and moderate income folks. That's the most critical need, or to address housing on the whole, allowing market rate developers to come in and provide more supply, because people think if there's a huge
More
demand,
supply.
we need more supply all across the board instead of just focusing on the low income and very
That's
low income.
true. That doesn't
Different philosophies.
necessarily mean just because you have far more supply that you're going to have people who can afford it, and that the prices somehow will go down.
Right. Yeah.
And it also doesn't mean that you'll have enough infrastructure to support the housing. I mean, if you build lots of apartment buildings for seniors in places where there's no transportation, or if you have massive housing in Stanford and without contributions to schools, I know that's a big concern now too. So these things kind of go hand in hand. The more housing you build, the more concerns there are about, do we have enough services to support those housing?
Yes, and you mentioned something a few minutes ago that we hadn't talked about, and that's traffic. And the more housing you have, the more cars you have on the street, the more traffic congestion. So what's going on in that area?
Well,
Okay.
So let's just start.
she has to sit in it a lot.
I just have one good story that I think that to me was like the best story related to transportation, or to traffic and transportation this year, and that is that the Crescent Park residents who live just on the west side of US 101 really got together because they were really bearing the brunt of all of the traffic jams. Some of the things I've written about, when people are stuck for 2 hours in traffic, are Carmageddons, when there's an accident on the bridge, for example, on the Dumbarton Bridge, and traffic is just slammed and you can't go anywhere. And those people couldn't get in and out of their driveways. They'd have to leave their car, or they just not come home for a few hours.
Oh my goodness.
And so the end result is that they really organized themselves as a neighborhood and got together with the city chief transportation official in Palo Alto and put out some suggestions. And some of the things are sort of your run-of-the-mill. Why don't we block off this road here, or or maybe we need to add turn lanes and that type of thing. But the one really good thing that came out of it is that he worked with the city of East Palo Alto and with Caltrans and got a Metropolitan Transportation Commission grant for roughly about $81,000. Plus, Palo Alto kicked in another $15,000 to study and upgrade, not necessarily replace, but replace in some cases, and upgrade the traffic signals from Middlefield Road to the Dumbarton Bridge, and also in East Palo Alto as well along the Donahoe corridor. So what that will do is that they're going to synchronize those traffic signals, so it's not stop and go, stop and go. And that might happen sometime later this year, meaning 2019. And so that is, even though Josh Mello, who was in charge of that project, has left, I understand from talking to the city that it's still in the works, and they do expect it to move forward.
I'm trying
in
to
2019.
visualize Middlefield Road to Dunbarton Bridge.
Right, Dunbarton, I'm sorry, along University Avenue.
Okay.
I should have said that's the part I left
okay.
out. A key,
Yes,
a key connector.
I was, yeah. So, you know,
yeah.
talking about traffic, I remember leaving the San Antonio Road area where we are, and I thought, well, I'll take a hop, skip, and a jump from, I'll go along Embarcadero, go over, and then shoot up 101 to City Hall, University Avenue. Usually it's like 5 minutes. It took 45.
Yeah.
And I will never, ever, during rush hour, try that route again.
I've left my car, parked it in the, the Crescent Park neighborhood, and walked home because it was faster. So we actually changed my hours, my work hours, so that I come in later and I leave later, and that's the way
That is just incredible. And when you're talking about affordable housing, putting in more housing, what can we do in terms of the traffic congestion?
Well, I think one thing that Palo Alto is trying to do is encourage different types of commute. They formed the Palo Alto Transportation Management Association, which is a nonprofit that's completely charged with getting people out of cars or getting people who drive to carpool to kind of lessen the congestion. But I feel like I'm really thankful that Sue brought up the Crescent Park story, because I feel like that's a rare bit of good news and what's otherwise been pretty bleak. I mean, since 2009, the number of people who have to drive 90 minutes or more to get to work, the mega commuters as they're called, has doubled, and that kind of helps drive the opposition to housing, because if you live in a neighborhood like Crescent Park and it takes you half an hour to get out of your driveway if you live near University Avenue, you're probably going to oppose housing.
So the idea would be more public transportation, right? Yes. So is that on anyone's list?
Definitely. Palo Alto wants to expand its shuttle program. They already have a program that subsidizes Caltrain passes for downtown employees, I think the council is going to discuss this actually next week, but from the report that I just saw today, I think in the last year they switched about 300 plus people from driving alone to other means, which is obviously a drop in the bucket when you consider the Silicon Valley transportation crisis, but it's some movement.
Sure.
You know.
And Jocelyn, I know on your list also is like technology. So is anything coming in terms of public transportation and technology?
Well, what's interesting is that while we think about public transportation as part of the solution to the traffic problems, self-driving cars and other kinds of ride sharing is also being looked at, because if people are used to taking Uber or Lyft or whoever, and millennials are, some of them don't own cars anymore, or like we used to get the license, get the car. If they're just used to using Uber and Lyft, then that's one car that is not on the road, owned personally by every individual. So there's that. And in terms of self-driving technology and regulation, 2018 was pretty significant because the DMV had proposed a program where companies can now test self-driving cars without a human being inside. Currently, there's safety drivers. They have to accompany.
So, you know, I saw an article that which company?
So Waymo, which is a subsidiary of
yes,
Alphabet.
but one company had decided to halt its self-driving program because of an accident in Arizona, I think, where a woman riding a bike was...
Sure. An Uber car killed a woman who was crossing a street with her bicycle. I don't remember if she was on the bicycle or if she was walking it across the street.
And there were people in that car at the time.
Yeah, there was a safety driver.
It's frightening, the thought, for many people that
certainly is.
A self-driving car without any people was given approval.
Yeah, and Waymo got their approval, I believe, is in October, and so they're going to be testing driverless self-driving cars in the streets of Palo Alto down to Sunnyvale, so Mountain View, Los Altos Hills.
So
they have said they're not going to do it right away, though.
Well, I'm just thinking if a self-driving car hits someone and nobody's in the car, who's at fault? Does the police come by and talk to the computer and say, "No, where's your license and where's your insurance?"
I assume it'd be the company behind the car.
Yeah.
But
At
I
this
think
point, yeah.
The
yeah,
company
but-
has said they have a lot of insurance to back
They'll
it up.
have.
They say they
I
have
would
it.
think.
But I think like self-driving cars are obviously an experimental technology that's still unfolding. But I feel like if we're going to talk about transportation improvements, there are also things happening that are kind of tried and true, and that are pretty easy to take for granted because they're so bread
Tried and
butter.
true.
Well, there's so many more bike projects happening everywhere. There's new bike bridges, East Palo Alto
yes.
and Palo Alto,
Yes,
and there's
yes.
the massive Caltrain project this year. The corridor is going to be electrifying. That project is kind of up and running now, and when that gets completed, you could pretty much double the number of Caltrain trains. So that's going to potentially shift some people from cars to public transit. So just to address the point about what could be done about traffic and housing.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, what is it that would need to make bike riding safer? Because even the mayor of San Jose recently was on his
got hit.
bike and was hit. Yeah, and I think a few years ago, the former mayor of San Francisco, Willie Brown, was on a bike during Bike Day. I think, and he got hit. And all you read about people, it's like motorcycles and cars. You know who the winner will be, and on a bike, no competition. So is that an issue?
Oh, yeah, it's an absolute issue, and I think it's an issue that Palo Alto has been super focused on since 2012 when it's passed this bike master plan. In the last year or two, we've seen the city move very aggressively on this subject. Not always to good effect. There was this one notorious project on Ross Road, the gigantic median island that pissed off more than 1,000 people, and the city had to kind
There
of
are all of
apologize
those
for.
islands as it is in the street, and that can be kind of confusing, that you have to go around.
Sure.
And,
And we might add
But you
that
also have
as a
projects
result.
like the bridge, like the bike bridge to the Baylands that's going to that the city approved this year. That's finally going to get kind of constructed. That's the kind of project that I think the city is looking at that could, foster really safe passage, because that's a bike bridge. There's no traffic, and it'll allow people to go from South Palo Alto to the Baylands.
Sure. So you were going to say?
Well, meanwhile, the one thing that has happened as a result of the Ross Road debacle is that city has temporarily halted. They put a moratorium on moving forward on their other bike boulevards in Palo Alto. So, that I don't know when they plan to start that up again. Giannotti might know
I
more
think
about
Charleston Restadero is still going ahead, but that's kind of a more broad streetscape project.
Yeah, but generally they're not going to do it for a little while, and so East Palo Alto will also have coming down
Yes.
the pipeline. I don't know when they plan to actually start implementing anything, but there will be these bike boulevards. I still feel personally that when you're driving along on a bike boulevard, there's no separation. When you've got a bike in front of you, it's still scary. I mean, if they're in the middle of the road, or you have 3 or 4 people riding their bikes abreast,
Yes,
and it's scary.
Yes, and
I don't
I'm
know if it's
thinking in
safe.
Embarcadero, I'm thinking the Bay Shore. That's 2 lanes near the post office. There is a sign that bicyclists can ride in the lane.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that seems like it's made for an accident.
Have you been on that during rush hour?
Oh, I try
With
not
the bicyclists weaving in and out of the traffic? It's scary. So I don't think that some of the solutions that are out there, so-called solutions, with the bike sharrows, a sharrow being this delineation in the middle of the road that is the little
Yes.
bicycle symbol for people who don't know what that is.
Yes.
I don't think that they're necessarily safer to me, but
Well,
I'm not
I-
a professional,
yeah,
but just as a driver.
I feel safer if I'm on a street like that and there is that indentation for the bicyclist.
Right.
If the bicyclist is there. And sometimes they're not. I mean, right at Embarcadero Road, and I'm thinking the Bay Shore, there are 2 lanes where you can go left and you can go right, and then there's the indentation. And I'm hoping, as I'm going straight, that the bicyclists will also veer towards the right.
Yeah.
And not stay in front. And some of them, I don't want to say anything against bicyclists.
Well, I think not all bike projects are created equal. I mean, there's neighborhood streets. I think Bike Boulevard is considered like a pioneering boulevard because it's not a major artery. It's very safe for bicyclists. There's very few stop signs, so bicyclists can kind of go straight without constantly stopping. And the cars know that they're on a bike boulevard, so you got to respect the bikers. When I drive in Bryant, I'm like, I'm on your turf, bicyclist, so I go extra slow. But yeah, but if you talk about El Camino and Alma Street, people could could very justifiably say this is a terrible place to kind of encourage bikers to go to, because they're pretty much highways.
But broadening from bicycles, I think a lot of cities are dealing now with regulation for e-scooters, electric bicycles, scooters particularly in San Francisco, San Jose. It's good in some ways that there are ways to get that last mile from like Caltrain. You've got to get from Caltrain station somewhere. You can just hop on a scooter and it'll take you there. But
as long as you leave it where it's supposed to be left and not all over the place, right?
Yeah, and cities are having to regulate people riding on sidewalks, people littering with scooters. But undeniably, it is another way to get around, and I think the future has probably more and more of those opportunities for people, but we're in this kind of trial period, trial and error.
So you said something, I don't want to say magical, Jocelyn, you said the future. And we talked about 2018 and where it's left us, and we've talked about some of the issues in 2018. So in what the time that we have left, can we talk about 2019?
Oh, yeah.
And then talk about what can we expect? Well,
crystal ball time.
We talked about some of what you just now mentioned in terms of e-scooters and alternate methods of transportation.
I think in 2019, one of the biggest issues that I'll be following, and I think is going to be a huge issue throughout the state, is this kind of festering opposition between what I think of as like regionalists and localists, particularly on the issue of housing. I feel like after many years of failure to build the kind of housing that the region needs, I feel like state legislators and various regional bodies are taking an increasingly more aggressive stance in kind of imposing kind of top-down regulations. And I think there's many people who think that that's exactly what's needed, given all the local oppositions to housing projects, like the 2013 projects we talked about earlier.
Yes.
So I think you're going to see a lot of city councils, Palo Alto's and others in our county, in Marin County, kind of rising up against kind of the state impositions, and there's going to be a lot of tension between those who say we need more housing, regardless of all these quality of life concerns and these strict parking regulations that kind of local councils talk about, and others who are saying, state, get off our kind of local control, you know.
The governor released his budget, our new governor, Newsom. Did you have a chance to take a look at it?
No.
No.
I haven't studied the budget, but I know that Newsom wants to build 3.5 million housing units by 2025, which kind of, I think, is going to help drive the whole regionalist.
Sure.
I think he'll be aggressive about signing bills.
There's one thing that we do need to mention, and that's his emphasis, it seems, on children and paternity leave, where, I don't know, did you hear in his address 6 months of paternity leave or maternity leave? Is that something that might be practical?
I guess it would depend on what job you have, but but I don't know about practical, but it's certainly emblematic of what cities are doing on their own. Palo Alto just adopted a parental leave policy like a month ago, quite belatedly compared to other cities in the region. So, you know, it's widely seen as a progressive and right thing to do. So,
for California, what about any ideas in terms of the rest of the nation? No.
Predictions for the rest of the nation?
Maybe not. I was just thinking
every week feels like a year. I can't predict what's going to happen tomorrow. We have a situation where the FDA isn't inspecting food and the TSA isn't inspecting planes.
We don't have global warming.
Yeah, that's what it is.
We don't?
Yeah.
Well, supposedly.
Yeah, so.
But then we've experienced the forest fires that certainly affected our area locally, right?
Yes, and Trump says he's not giving the money now through FEMA.
We'll see.
Yes.
But that's another thing we didn't touch on as a big story is the silence behind the whole, anything related to global warming. But the just sort of stripping away of science, and we are now beginning to see the repercussions of all of that, right? And we're starting to see these massive fires, then there's landslides. We're still in a drought here. We still, the snowpack is still only, about 65% of what it should be this time of year. So these are all things that we're going to see.
It's better.
Okay. Well,
No, you say there are certain things we're seeing. There's certain things you might be seeing, but they're not things that the administration is seeing.
right. I'm saying where is right. Where is, yeah, it all depends on what side you're on. But
Yeah.
I think the other thing, too, that we can say that a good story that happened related to the global warming in the environment this year was the opening up of the downward section of San Francisco Creek after all of the flood mitigation that just happened. And I think that's very good news for us. You know, I was there, I believe maybe you were there as well when the rain was coming down, when they were having
yes.
the ribbon cutting, so to speak.
Yes.
And we just know that the next phase is going to be upstream, and that'll be, you know, by 2020 we should start seeing some forward movement on that.
Okay, so we have transportation, we have traffic, we have global warming.
We're going to have chaos. We're going to have chaos in the national scene.
Affordable housing, we have immigration. Anything we've left out, Jocelyn, that you want to comment on?
I just have to say that, you know, being with the hyperlocal newspaper, we see things getting done at the local level. And there may be chaos on the national level. We may see entrenched warfare between parties. But city councils, different nonprofit organizations are pretty much focused on trying to make things happen. And I know that both for the Palo Alto School District and the City of Palo Alto, they've got leaders now who are just starting. Don Austin last year for the Palo Alto School District, and the City of Palo Alto now has Ed Shikata. They're very much operations people. They're get it done, let's make things better, let's make things work kind of people. So I don't know, I think the national can take an example from the local.
That's quite interesting. Now, having 3 journalists and being one myself, what's going on in terms of media? And right now, I heard from you that there are more people familiar with Palo Alto online than the printed Palo Alto Weekly.
Yeah, the media landscape is changing. I mean, everyone's hooked to their cell phones. They're getting a lot of information from there. Print readership is not what it used to be. It's not, people don't need to go out to the corner box and get the newspaper when they're finding information online. But we are seeing a lot more support for our newspaper and other newspapers. New York Times has huge subscriber program that's just, you know, skyrocketed. They're getting a lot of revenue from there. People are recognizing the importance and the value.
The last few words, Gennady?
I think we're going to look back at the last year as like an amazing time for journalism on the national level. We try to do our part, but when you look at the Harvey Weinstein stuff, when you look at what the Washington Post and the New York Times have been doing with all the Trump scandals, there's just been one blockbuster after another, all the Me Too stuff. So I'm pretty optimistic when it comes to the media, even if I'm a little pessimistic about
I
print.
need to save a few seconds for
Sue.
you. Yes, for Sue.
Well, I just think that it remains to be seen, because we are sort of the seat of internationalism. You know, we have so many people coming here. We've got Stanford, we have Silicon Valley, and there may be some very interesting stories that come out of that this year. So we'll see.
Oh.
We certainly have Theranos coming up.
So we live in a bubble that's inclusive,
A mesh bubble.
a mesh bubble that's international. And so we've covered a lot. We've covered a lot in terms of national. We've covered a lot locally. We've covered a lot hyper-locally. And so we'll see what happens for 2019. Thank you so much
Thanks for having us.
sharing
Thanks very
2018 into 2019. And I'd like to thank our viewers for watching in terms of next time. And the music is kind of cutting me off.
Getting the Oscar treatment.
Yes.